You're all very welcome. It's marvellous to see such a huge audience for Irish history. This is one in the eye for the scientists who claim no one's interested in the humanities anymore, but of course they are, and here you all are to support it. The Transformation of Ireland by Diarmaid Ferriter, published in 2004, was the first survey history of 20th century Ireland in many years. Now, 20 years later, comes the sequel, The Revelation of Ireland, bringing us exciting new research and insights for 1995 to 2020, a deep dive into a turbulent and exciting period, which also has the virtue of us all having lived through it. So we will remember many of the events that Diarmaid will be describing in the book. Diarmaid's Professor of Modern Irish History at University College Dublin and probably Ireland's best known historian. He has published many books since the transformation, the most recent being the acclaimed Between Two Hells, The Irish Civil War, The Revelation of Ireland, will be published later this year, but he has graciously consented to give you a foretaste of what is to come to keep you happy in the long, dark nights after Samhain, when we've nothing else to be doing but reading wonderful history books and enlightening ourselves. Diarmaid's interlocutor is Gearóid O'Tuathaigh, Emeritus Professor of History at the University of Galway, and an absolute favourite with First Talks audiences. Lorna Siggins wrote about him in the Irish Times in 2015 on the occasion of his Festschrift being published. Quote, "Catch a glimpse of O'Tuathaigh on one of his frequent forays to the Saturday St. Nicholas's Church Market in Galway, and you'd never think that this was a man who knows more than a thing or three about the state of the Irish language, the land question, De Valera, the North, Melbourne's Irish administration, home rule in Irish politics, Ireland before the famine, and the GIA," end quote. I can only concur, he knows every damn thing. Please welcome these two wise men, Diarmaid Ferriter and Gearóid O'Tuathaigh.
I'll go over to the far side. Now, thank you, Katrina. And I was remarking, I'm sure some of you came around from the far pavilion, as it were, to this building. And I was remarking rather ominously along the outside cladding, there was warning compressed gas. And I was wondering, this had no reference whatever, I'm sure, to the morning session or this afternoon session. You're very welcome this afternoon, Fáilte Róibh. We all know, Diarmaid, that there's frequent warnings given to historians and indeed to everybody else about the hazards of contemporary history. The hazards relating to closeness to the events, sources, the perspective, the gravitational pull of present-centred questions. Now, clearly you weren't deterred by any of these warnings, but could you give us an idea of what particular challenges you encountered in writing the period 1995-2020 for Ireland?
The most recent challenge I had relates to the title. I was originally going to call this book Roaring Inside.
Yeah.
And the publishers had an editorial meeting in London and decided that it sounded like a book that was about gastric distress or gut problems. But I took the Roaring Inside idea from Anne Enright's The Gathering, her Booker Prize-winning novel in 2007. And it's about Veronica Hegarty and the Hegarty family trying to come to terms with the death of their sibling and a troubled past. And it's about searching for something that she's not sure of. And she feels it roaring inside her, you know, this past, this troubled past. And I thought to myself, I've lived through a period now in recent times where there's been an awful lot of roaring inside and roaring outside, some of it very distressing. And I was very conscious that I had very firm views on all of those things. And that's a challenge for contemporary history, because you do want to strive for a degree of objectivity and you are conscious of your own prejudices, but also the emotional hinterland of experience and how you felt about things and how material comes into the public domain that is based on things that happened in the past, but that is not necessarily very well historicized. And what I mean by that is that if there are revelations, for example, about institutional abuse or the terrible experiences of people who were victims of excessive power and brutal power, There can be a tendency sometimes to insist that their narrative is then the truth, or that a commission report is a document of truth. That was a phrase that was often used. And I suppose I was very conscious as a historian that we need to move beyond that a bit and try and be a bit more nuanced. So the challenge really for me is about contemporary history through a long historical lens, so that you're not starting the history in 1995. Chronologically, you are in terms of the structure of the book, but that you're dealing with themes that need to involve an awareness of how they evolved over a very extended period. So that's certainly a challenge. But also, distance, perspective, and sources. I would have been used in the past to burying myself in an awful lot of archival material and then surfacing. And trying to craft a narrative. This was different in that a lot of that archival material isn't available. Some of it is, with the peace process, but a lot of it isn't. But at the same time, we have an avalanche of digital records and reports, and an awful lot of the material that I mentioned there is now available in multi-volumes. And we're also living through an age of the shortcut, or the tyranny of the instant. And there's an awful lot of misinformation, social media, very short and unsatisfactory appraisals of very difficult historic topics. And I thought that contemporary history was taking on even more urgency because of that.
Yeah. Could I pick you up on the title that eventually you settled on? And you've mentioned it, the Revelations.
Yeah.
The Book of Revelations, as it were, has a certain echo of its own. But I think we could all of us immediately identify how central the revelations were. That is to say, what was revealed. In a lot of these reports, as you say, through courageous investigative journalism, through TV documentaries, through the pioneering researchers, the Mary Rafterys, the Catherine Corlises, the Christina Buckleys, and so on. And also to the more, quote, systematic collection of data for particular reasons. The Murphy Report, the Ryan Report, Cloyne, Ferns, the Commission, and so on. That's the what, as it were, of revelations, which constitutes a considerable body of data, but as you rightly say, one that still has to be interrogated. The why is another question. Can you explain what does the fact that there was such an avalanche of disclosure, such an avalanche of confessional, such an avalanche of witness bearing, against essentially what was a culture of concealment, if you like, not necessarily of secrecy, mark you, but a culture of concealment and silence. What in the last 25 years, since the mid-1990s, what propelled, do you think, what generated such an incredible amount of public witness to this particular episode? Have you an answer to that, or is there a reason?
I remember being in UCD in 1992. I was a postgraduate student, and the Bishop Eamon Casey scandal broke in 1992, and I was talking to Margaret McCurtain at the time, her sister Ben, as some people remember her, because I had worked with her as an undergraduate student, and she was telling me some very entertaining stories about Eamon Casey when he was Bishop of Kerry. And a couple of weeks later, I read a piece which was about a mother and daughter, and the mother was a very, very pious, committed Catholic, daily communicant. Her daughter had all sorts of questions and doubts and criticisms. And she came in with the newspaper headline about Casey, and she slapped it down on the kitchen table, and she said, "Well, Ma, what do you make of that?" And there was a sense that we were kind of joking about this in 1992 as an overdue comeuppance. So there was a generational question there in relation to there being less deference and there being obviously the exposure of more hypocrisy. And that developed a certain momentum. I remember T-shirts being sold on O'Connell Street, which I was telling Margaret McCurtain about, that were emblazoned with the words, "Wear a condom just in Casey." And I was just saying how irreverent we have become, you know. And then, of course, there was a very dark side.
You were shocked.
We were shocked.
You were shocked, of course.
There was a very dark side to all that as well, of course, which was also about mother and baby homes. That was also about abusive power and everything else. But the point was, I was talking to Margaret about, you know, what's this going to do to the church in terms of its position on teaching and preaching about women and about contraception and all these things. Certain things were starting to come at that stage as well. The X case the same year, the X case in 1992, and that generated a momentum that changed attitudes and changed ideas. There were those...
The public sphere, just how would you respond to the notion that under the reception, in other words, the openness to this, why the public conscience was seized by this at this particular time?
Well, it's partly as well about a growing up. I remember in 1997, for the 75th anniversary of the state, Tom Garvin, whose work was very provocative, had said, right, we're looking at a generation of revolutionaries. They transformed themselves into politicians. Overall, they got it more right than they got it wrong. But that was that was very legitimate. He was talking about a democracy that had survived for 75 years, given what was going on elsewhere. There was a robustness to all that about how we manage certain things, but it was quite narrowly framed in terms of the political science of it. I think what changed in relation to your question was that that framework was broadened, and we started thinking, well, what has the Irish experience been? Who has been in control? Who has had the power? If you look at the work of Sebastian Barry, for example, in the cultural sphere, but he's also dealing with history, and he would say, it's not just the people who came to hold the power who own this history or this historical experience. There was more of an interest in the idea of challenging that sense of a national narrative, but there were other national narratives. And people were also reacting, of course, to the crumbling of traditional authority structures.
And on sources, you mentioned, just a brief, if you like, addendum to it, the democratization, if you like, of access to sources, which comes with digitization. The 1901 and 1911 census and the enormous curiosity in family history and tracing. And finding that family history was not as we had been told in many families, and then leading from that into the First World War and the records that became available over a 10-year period of every kind, intimate pension files and so on. There was a sense in which access to it created a climate that was hospitable
no
to
doubt
rethinking things and to removing concealment.
And the very idea of personal testimony or a personal witness to history, or how can I relate this national story to my own immediate experience, and people have that accessibility now. But they also, as you allude to, they discover uncomfortable things.
Yes.
Sometimes they're skeletons. Sometimes they are just distressing, because they can be about poverty, they can be about dispossession, they can be about difficult things that were not talked about. And I remember having a mature student studying in UCD who came back after he had retired, and he found a statement from his father, which was the conversation he had never had with him. And his father's statement was about his War of Independence experience. But that in turn leads on to other questions. But in relation to the institutions and the experiences of children, there's a renewed focus on the idea of welfare and how can we explain how people were
treated in this
and
way.
Why?
Could I just give you a quotation on that then? Because a central institution of it, you've mentioned it already, was the Church of the Majority, the Catholic Church, which had such a prominent presence in this institutional culture of incarceration and concealment and so on. In 2018, Diarmaid Martin, who was then Archbishop of Dublin, was musing aloud, as it were, or questioning aloud this terrible avalanche that had uncovered all of that, and also adverting to the uncomfortable presence of Irish surnames in other countries who had been, who had emerged as well. And he asked the question, what was it in Irish Catholicism, not among the clergy now, but in Irish Catholicism, that led to such a level of harshness? Now, in the light of what you've been immersed in for the last few years, on the 20-year, and in the longer perspective in which you look at it, how would you answer that question from Diarmaid Martin?
I remember Diarmaid Martin being interesting precisely because he was asking those questions. And I remember him making a beeline down to the questions and answers programme hosted by John Bowman. Do you remember the current affairs programme?
Yes.
And the idea of a Catholic Archbishop of Dublin going onto a panel, questions and answers, to be interrogated, to hold his hands up and say, we have to be humble, you know, and I say, well, that's a steep bloody learning curve, you know, you have to be humble. I remember a young researcher in RTE when we were doing a programme on McQuaid, and he says, I'll go off and get some archival material of McQuaid speaking or whatever, and I said, good luck with that, you know. They didn't engage with the media in that way, so this is very different, and he realised that there needs to be a complete culture change. And they're the kind of questions he started asking. And my answer to that, again, it's about the contemporary history through a long historical lens. You've got to go back to the 19th century and even earlier. How did this style of Catholicism and the governance around it, how did it evolve? What forces were at play in terms of the power that was at work, the alliances that were made between leaders of the church and other community leaders? How did it relate to land? Why was there so much snobbery? I quote Paul Cullen, for example, who was obviously such a dominant figure in mid-19th and late 19th century Catholicism and was very focused on rigid new rules, but he was also a very learned man and a very compassionate man in many ways. And he made the point at one stage that too high an education for the poor will make them discontented and will make them troublesome. And there's a very strong focus on the idea of a very rigid hierarchy in relation to social relations and structure. There's a pessimism there as well in relation to how young seminarians are being trained. But there's also, of course, in relation to control of education, of all of the other areas of health. And then I think the Civil War had a huge impact. It shook the Catholic Church in ways sometimes that we forget because we have this narrative of domination. But, you know, that had to be cemented further after independence.
But
so
I'm interested in the long-term thing, the kind of the valorization of a version of respectability.
Oh, the quest for respectability.
And absolutely. It is the 19th century embourgeoisement of the culture generally.
Yeah. And I mean, that quest for respectability continues. You know, I think huge impact on women in particular. You know, and again, I was quoting the Archbishop of Tuam, Thomas Gilmartin, in 1926. Yes. The future of Ireland is bound up with the dignity and the purity of its women. And when you think of the consequences of that, because if they transgressed, that's when you get the transgression and the attitude to the transgression, and it's linked in to all these other themes. But I also got interested in the unexamined landscapes, because it's not enough to focus on the bullies and the villains, and we can't be so reductionist that we see our history in terms of heroes and villains. There were 11,000 women in religious life in Ireland in 128 congregations in 1989. There are now about 4,000 of them. The average age of them is over 80. Yeah. Who are they? Yeah. Now, think about what they were doing, what they run. Is it true, as Maria Luddy, the historian, pointed out, that in some ways they were victims too? They were removed from society. They were told to live a pure life. And you begin to think about what the institution did to them. And they were also victims of snobbery within the church as well because of what they were not allowed to do. But of course, they did have significant power and control in relation to those domains or areas that they had a lot of influence over. So that unexamined landscape, but also the mediating structures through which people experience their Catholicism. There's no point in just focusing on the abuse stories. They're hugely important, and I'm not in any way trying to deny that. But we have to think about how people experience their Catholicism. What did it mean to them? Did they get joy out of it? Did they get reassurance out of it? What about the pageantry around it, the participation, the sodalities? You know, what does that mean?
McGahern's spire and the centre of the aesthetic in other ways.
And I mean, he did allude to the kind of parish priest bullies, but there were also an awful lot of people involved in religious life who did extraordinary work.
Can we move on to... and it's not a prompt by references to bullies and villains now, but could we move on to Northern Ireland? But Northern Ireland is a central feature of that period from the immediate prelude to the Good Friday Agreement up to the day before yesterday, as it were. Now, the peace process, capital to uppercase, and then the Good Friday Agreement and living up to it or living within it or living through it or whatever the case may be. Is the verdict too strict that the Good Friday Agreement, the achievement of the Good Friday Agreement, was the cessation of violence, full stop? A prize of inestimable value in any society.
I do not think that is too harsh.
But after, what else? What has been constructed? What framework has emerged in civil society in which a deeply divided community, fragmented indeed, not just binary, but a deeply could find ways in which to contribute uninhibitedly, instead of one crowd essentially being obsessed with closet Lundies in every single sub-clause of every document, apart from the weather forecast. And the others are obsessed with confessional demography to see when does a majority or a minority become a majority. What in the meantime has happened
that one
could take solace from?
I moved in with the negotiators for the guts of a year between Belfast, London and Dublin, because the papers have been released.
Right.
How did they construct this peace process? And it's kind of a floating drafting process, as Sean O'Higgins described it. And John Chilcott in the Northern Ireland office was talking about moving from metaphorical language to sharp, precise points to try and get things over the line. Occasionally there's a bit of humour in there. Like during all the decommissioning standoff, there were awful draft proposals, and eventually one exasperated civil servant in Dublin said, "I think we have one final shot at this." And then he added, "P.S. maybe that wasn't the best choice of word." But so it's a fascinating overview of the diplomatic construction of it. But I think you're right. Peace processing became an end in itself. What remained elusive was the shared society idea. Now, it's fascinating to watch or to read the accounts of those who were up close with those who were negotiating and finding new ways to offend each other and insult each other. And the hissy fits and the drama queendom that was going on, like some of it unintentionally funny, but also the genuine desire to stop the killing. And the more distance we have now, we can forget how important that was. But I was very drawn in this book to the younger writers from Northern Ireland who are asking much more complicated questions, resenting being called ceasefire babies. They did not see that as a label they wanted to carry because it implied that the job was done. And the way Lyra McKee, before she was murdered, would have put it, they saddled their trauma on our backs and called us ceasefire babies, and we were told to get on with it.
Yes.
Or Michael McGee in Closer to Home, a brilliant young Belfast writer. And he writes about class and masculinity, but also the intergenerational trauma, because his mother, the addiction to Valium and how they coped with that. But also Lisa McGee in Derry Girls, having to point out, the troubles, but we also had love, and we had humour, and we had warmth, and we had fun, and we had wit. But translating that into a broader shared society, very difficult. Lias Saudi, who was a brilliant young writer and musician who settled in Cookstown in 1998, again after the killing has stopped broadly. He talked about the community he was observing, and it was condemned, he said, to a crumbling narrative. And they were holding on to this narrative, even whilst it was disappearing. And he said they chose loathing over mediocrity. They couldn't live with mediocrity. And there was a spike in suicides in 1998, and a special group, mental health experts in the Northern Ireland office, concluded that this was partly due to the cessation of violence, because there was a vacuum, and what had become dependable for them was no longer there. We forget this, Gearóid, that between 1998 and 2014, there were 3,700 suicides in Northern Ireland. 3,700 suicides, so more than were killed during the Troubles. Now, when you start digging into that, you're looking at social deprivation, you're looking at segregation, you're looking at, the lack of people being, I suppose, educated together. But you're also going back to 1998. Bertie Ahern was adamant in 1998, and he did a very effective job in terms of the partnership with Blair and everything. But the point he was making is that we have to design this peace process to make sure that both communities get what they want in as watertight a way as possible. Now, that may have got things over the line in 1998, but that is not a model for, in any way, a shared society. So those things will obviously take a long, long time. But we need to hear those voices of that generation.
Is it possible even to exaggerate the destructive impact of Brexit in the middle of this entire episode, in the middle of these 25 years that you've been looking at? It's in its impact on Anglo-Irish relations. I mean, when one thinks, for example, of the closing period of Cameron and the late Queen coming to Dublin and all the rest of it, the kind of extravagant cordiality of Anglo-Irish relations at the time, and when you think that what happens in such a short time after that referendum, in the public domain, in rhetoric, in behaviour.
Well, I remember being over in London at the time. Do you remember Boris Johnson prorogued Parliament illegally? And they were waiting for the Supreme Court decision over in Britain. And I was actually doing research in the parliamentary archives, reading the correspondence of Churchill and Lloyd George. And you may not have liked these particular individuals, but you could see how they did the business of politics and how they were handling Anglo-Irish relations. And this isn't a tribute to them or a compliment to them, but just how serious was the business of politics and political management. And that completely fell asunder. It was chaotic. And what's interesting about the Irish response is how canny it is. In that immediately there was a 12-person cabinet subcommittee set up with a view to how will we respond to Brexit. you build alliances. We're quite crafty in terms of this. You make sure that you keep the focus on the few things that you can manage. Keep the focus on the border, you know, and we get EU solidarity around that. And we suddenly start to appear much more sophisticated. But what it also did is it flexed our nationalist muscle. Partly because we had to look at the likes of Jacob Rees-Mogg and listen to the idiocy, but also because it was the era when the likes of Liam Fox, the Conservative MP, and Michael Gove were talking about, oh, you historians are denigrating.
All former MP.
Yeah, yes, former. I wonder why. You know, you are denigrating patriotism, and we need to make Britain great again. You know, and you had
that strain, though, it didn't just affect us.
No, but yeah,
if you look at
true.
the configuration on the devolution arguments within the United Kingdom after Blair, look at what happened in Scotland. Now, there are particular circumstances, but if you look at the emergence of a narrow and strident English nationalism, both in the run-up to Brexit and in the celebration of it, as it were, getting it done, even before the pandemic hit.
But we also had I remember the morning of the result being announced, thinking about all these questions that we thought had been settled and they were being opened up again, including the border. Obviously, there'd been very little mention of the border. But I remember Varadkar as well saying to Northern Nationalists, never again will you be left behind by an Irish government. And I said to myself when I was thinking about that in the book, well, let's look back now about how they were left behind and what did that mean. And then there was much talk about the Unity train having left the station. So it really did reconfigure things. And in terms of the Anglo-Irish dynamic, it's interesting at the moment that we're constant talk of reset. Now, what were they trying to reset? You know, what had been...
Civility and cordiality in the first instance.
Absolutely.
And listening.
And pragmatism.
Yes.
You know, and but also trying to see around corners. You know, what is potentially coming up that we need to look out for? And I mean, that had been honed to quite a significant degree prior to 2016.
Coming to politics and the political landscape in the Republic. One of the things that emerges in most commentaries is the continuing fragmentation of party loyalties. And the evidence is irrefutable, the combined vote of the two major parties, a diminishing portion of the total vote. And then to see fragmentation as with the capital F and so on. But to put a counter case, to do devil's advocate on that. If you look at ideology, however, and look at the roller coaster story of the Irish economy for the years that you've looked at in detail, from the raging, roaring tiger of the mid-1990s and late 90s, through the property and credit bubble, through the catastrophe and crash, the lengthy penance, the shriving in public, the abasement before cliché.
You should write a poem about this.
But all of that, and then, remarkably, the recovery. We pay our debts. We are people who know how to take our medicine.
The Celtic comeback.
We are back, and we are back as the poster boy of Europe. We're not like those Greeks. We're not trying to write off anything. We know what it's like. We've done we all went mad together. We're going to come out of this together. And you look at how convulsive that was in terms of the socialization of debt and so on and so forth. There's no polarization. There's no insurrection. There's no extreme parties. We have a centrist reconfiguration within the tiniest of margins. We have a centrist reconfiguration which announces, and it's not just due to PR, a centrist reconfiguration with some tidying up here and there that announces a deeply conservative society.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, and
one of the points I would be making as well in relation to that is that we don't just have to focus on the politicians and the political groupings and the fragmentation and their conservatism or otherwise. We also need to think about the electorate and the choices that they make and why they make them. And again, that's where you have to dig quite deeply to look at how our political culture evolved and people's preferences, right up to the 1980s, over 80% of the vote was going to the big Civil War parties, and obviously it did become much more fragmented. But I do remember the question being asked, why aren't we going down the Greek path? And part of the answer was, we talk about the burden of our history. We need to get perspective. What about the burden of Greek history or the burden of Italian history? So that partly explains is that we maybe haven't had it as bad as we think we have. Because of the economic model we had as well, for all its faults, they were able to refloat things relatively quickly. in terms of the globalization and the export orientation. And that wasn't necessarily an advantage that other European economies in trouble had. But it's also about we're risk averse. If you think, for example, about French politics, and again, the long history there, and how they manage, and there are troubled times there as well now, but how they manage to build alliances, sometimes relatively quickly, to either get things done or to prevent things from being done. We don't do politics in that way. Ideology is something that's frowned upon. I remember when John Bruton died there recently, and I was talking about ideology in Fine Gael in the book, he was regarded with suspicion because he was an ideas man, as if that was a terrible thing to be in Irish politics. And there were Fine Gael backbenchers, and you have to watch that fella. He doesn't know the woods from the trees because he's an ideas man, And he used to say himself, I'm not an ideological politician, I'm a conviction politician.
Yes.
And Bertie Ahern would have said, I love tramping the streets. Remember the journalist Roisin in the Irish Times has been woken up one morning by the Taoiseach who was out canvassing. And there was no general election on the horizon, And he said, and she said, what other country would politics be practiced like that? But that in its own way, I think, is part of the conservative nature of Irish politics. There's a certain kind of intimacy.
But the other there are two. I mean, for example, it was long argued that one of the reasons was that we exported dissent. We had the exit model of emigration in successive generations when we went through troubles in the 1930s and so on. That didn't apply in the main for the period from the mid-1990s to 2020.
Was there something that we felt we deserved it? We've had our good times, and now we have to...
You're back to Catholic guilt again.
Well, I mean, but it's not just Catholic guilt, there's also a post-colonial thing there.
There is, yes.
And I mean, it's quite complex psychologically, and I certainly wouldn't dismiss it. Now, some people would argue that it's actually served us well. I mean, I do remember Mary Holland, when she was reflecting on the divisions in 1980s Britain under Thatcher, and she said, I'm actually glad that the political debate in this country is rooted in whose grandfather shot whose grandfather, because we're not tearing each other apart in relation to the big societal questions. But that's also part of the problem of our model of politics. And things might well change, but you can also see that those who potentially would provide radical alternatives were going out of their way to be reassuring. It's kind of a problem for Sinn Féin at the moment. I was quoting Mary Lou MacDonald in the book when she addressed a breakfast meeting of business leaders, and she said, we have a vested interest in Sinn Féin in commercial and business success. We're not a threat to the model that we have. So that's the kind of continuation of that.
It links back to what you were saying about the astuteness and agility of the diplomats in the political negotiations, that essentially, to a degree, it's simultaneously surfing mobile American capitalism in a globalized capital, and at the same time, Berlin and Boston together, not either or, and essentially Berlin as the social model.
But it can also lead to embarrassing moments. I mean, Donald Trump arrived here in 2014 as just a blowhard, bankrupt businessman, odious in every way. He wasn't president or remotely near being president. There was a red carpet laid out by Michael Noonan, the Minister for Finance. Why? Because he was bringing money to the Doonbeg resort. And, Bertie Ahern would have made the point that he welcomed the election of George Bush when he was running against John Kerry, even though a lot of Irish people would have preferred to have seen a Democrat. And he said, well, when it comes to the economic policies now, that's where we are. And this is the same politician who would have talked about the moral dimension of our foreign policy. It's not a moral dimension. You're looking after yourself. And I mean, he would applaud the anti-Iraq war protests, whilst out of the other side of his mouth saying, we can't condemn American foreign policy, So there's a lot of self-serving going on. But in relation to the model and the economic model, think of how unsexy this sounds, that you would have medium-term sustainable growth. Because
totally
that was supposed to be the aim, and that means that you don't increase current spending by more than 4% per annum. I would love to have lived in a country that had medium-term sustainable growth. But that's not the country we lived in. And part of that is related not just to the lack of economic or intellectual heft within the Department of Finance, it's also, again, related to our politics. When you think about what people respond to and what they were looking for. We talk about champagne charity, and when you have it, you spend it. But he made the point when he talked to the Oireachtas Banking Committee, well, they left out the second half of what I said. I said when you have it, you spend it. The mistake is to spend it when you don't have it.
Yes.
And yet, they are these mistakes that they continued to make. What were we as an electorate?
Well, it depends on
doing
what you're
about
spending
that?
it on, as Keynes would do,
Yeah.
isn't it? Now, I'm mindful of the clock because I know that Katrina would like to have some questions and comments from members of the audience for a few moments before the session concludes. But we have one or two more things that perhaps you might like to say something on. One of them is that in a book in 1989, Joe Lee, looking at assessing the performance of the Irish state, essentially, came, among many other provocative conclusions, came to one conclusion that I know we both of us harped on a number of times, that generally speaking, leadership, and not just the political leadership, but generally the leadership, intellectual and so on and so forth, in Ireland had been very adroit and agile and tactically superb, but that strategic thinking or strategic planning had been a disappointment. Now, looking at the 25 years from 1995, in the light of the societal changes that are taking place now and that have taken place over that period of time, is that verdict still one that sits with your experience from being immersed in the material, in the data for the last 25 years?
I'm even more convinced of the accuracy of the verdicts now. Jolie's book caused quite a stir at the time, and there were those who felt that there were too many casual indictments of the nation and the leadership. But the point he was making is that it's not enough to trade off survival. And you think about housing now, which we have talked about in the crisis in housing for so long. There was an NESC report, National Economic and Social Council report in 2004, that identified all the obvious problems. We need to bolster our social housing stock. We also need viable and integrated housing communities and housing projects. And this has to be planned for. This is why these groups exist. But they usually fall victim to the electoral cycle or to short-sightedness. That became more and more apparent. The same is true of sláinte care and healthcare generally, and the power of vested interests and the failure to be able to move beyond their power or break their power. There is a lack of that long-term thinking. The most important crisis we face now is a climate one. And again, it's fascinating to go into the archives now and look at 1990, where concern was being expressed in the Department of Taoiseach about emissions and the ozone effect, as we used to call it then. And again, we know we had the wettest 10-year period in 300 years from 2008 to 15, or 2008 to 2018. That data was there, and it's back then, when you begin doing something about it. So the vision thing has been a problem, but it's also about us not having a very effective model of how we measure our quality of life. The Swedish concept of the measurement of life quality I find very interesting, because it's not just about a booming economy or us being the most globalized or outperforming or the best little country in the world to do business.
Yes.
It's also about mental health. It's about physical health. It's about childcare. It's about all these issues where we have failed to plan. And generally speaking, those who are in the business of articulating a vision get derided for it, or else become victims.
They're not too insistent in seeking a platform, though, in many cases.
No, that's fair.
I'll give one final one just to see what your response to it, because we'll open then. If we look, I was intrigued to look at the 2020 general election, for example. Immigration didn't feature, or scarcely featured at all. A couple of short years before, in 2017, when Leo Varadkar became Taoiseach, it was seen as a really good story, a good Irish story, a man with that background and so on and so forth. Now, looking at what has happened, and you've documented this thoroughly, and its implications teased out, that we have moved decisively, really, in that 25-year period, from being a mother country for a diasporic people with immigrants, which we are deeply proud of, and where we glow whenever they glow. And it doesn't matter what the glow is, whether it is remote names doing business, or whether it's the whole world being green on Patrick's Day, or a Coltis branch opening in Van Diemen's Land, or river dance everywhere. It doesn't matter. Now, moving from being a mother country to being a host country to sizable communities who will be celebrating Ramadan, Africa Day, who will be hyphenating in cultural terms for their children and their children's children. What kind of thinking is going on, given that in the short 4 years since 2020, we see what's happening, erupting, the unpleasantness and the poison?
There was an official
thinking.
There was an official publication called Migration Nation. I think it was around 2008. And what was stated in that is that we are uniquely equipped to deal with the challenges of immigration because of our own history of emigration. And it is comical.
It is.
But that was the level of the piety that was there. Now, communities were doing their own thing in terms of an awful lot of solidarity. I mean, when I was looking at the 2011 census returns, there were 199 different countries represented on those census returns. 36% of the population of Gort were Brazilians. You know, I mean, it was fascinating when you started digging down. And there were some very successful integration stories. But in 2000, one of our MEPs said racism was endemic in Dublin. Now, a lot of people would have felt that that was an exaggeration, but the point was being made, where are these migrants ending up? They were mostly ending up in deprived areas. That's what they were talking about Dublin City at the time. And it was generating tensions for the reasons that we're aware of. But, you know, in the broader sense, what was needed was the continuance. There was a committee set up on racism and interculturalism, which was disbanded in 2008 because it was the low-lying fruit. It was regarded as a luxurious extra. There was also a pact between politicians that they wouldn't allow immigration to become an election issue. That became more difficult to sustain. But in terms of the actual planning, and we now have the CSO projections, and I'm often making that point that the Central Statistics Office is not just an ivory tower. It's not just there for academics to prove how agile and brilliant they are. It's to assist the planning process. So if you, and again, it's difficult to do it in a very accurate way in terms of the future. But, you know, you have, the migration theme is not just an Irish theme, it's an international theme. Ireland is going to remain a very attractive destination for very obvious reasons and reasons some of which we could be happy about. But
we can't continue indefinitely to say we are dealing with an emergency.
Oh, well, absolutely.
I mean,
no, but you see, it needs to, and it's the great historic reversal.
It is.
That a country that was all about the exodus, and that was never going to be managed brilliantly in the short term. But, you know, given the change in the texture of Irish society now, we need to acknowledge that that's what we are now.
When you head to Gort and you head in for a social evening, you may be asked, where are you from originally? Now, Katrina, Okay. Further question, and it goes back to Katrina's opening remark, and I was intrigued by it. A personal question, but which has an obvious professional inflection. You have spent the last few years going through an enormous range of source material, archival, where it's available, official reports, newspapers, ephemera, creative literature, popular art form in the culture across the media, and all of the other. And you've researched and you've looked at a couple of key themes and so on. Now, you've done that as a historian for 25 years. 25 years, 1995 to 2020. These were the years, if I can put it without blushing, these were the years of your own maturation as a historian to the eminence that you now enjoy. But also, as Katrina said, you have lived through these 25 years. You knew or know some of the dramatis personae who feature in these researches and who came up in your files and in your reading. You have taken, as it were, and felt the temper of the times throughout that 25 years, left impressions on you, and memories already, some of them, you know, congealing, some of them dissolving. Now, I'm not going to ask you where are the villains and where are the heroes of that 25 years, but a different question is this. Are there any episodes, or indeed even individual actors, where your immersion in the sources has compelled you to revise a settled opinion that you might have had in real time through the lived experience of those 25 years? Now, that may be an unfair question, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
I think I was forced into, or persuaded into a reassessment of the impact of the Catholic Church in a broad way. I didn't grow up in a particularly religious household. I remember my mother walking out of Mass in 1992 and telling me she wasn't going back because the priest was spouting fantastical nonsense, as she saw it, about women. And I thought that was a very interesting response. And I was thinking about my own attitude. And there was a degree of cynicism there. I was a boy chorister in the Pro Cathedral when I was a child, you know, singing with the Palestrina boys. And what I loved about Catholicism, it's the only thing I liked really was the music as part of the ceremonies and the incense and the processions. But I didn't practice religion in any way. But that made me more determined not to be cynical about it, because I was conscious of history becoming about a cynicism over everything, you know, that could take over. It's what Anne Dolan has described as writing the history of a disappointment. So I was interested in how people were navigating their emotional hinterlands. And I found that particularly interesting within the church. And it wasn't about justifications. It was about a more nuanced empathy with people who were forced into lives that they wouldn't necessarily have chosen for themselves. I got more interested in, because I was so privileged, as you say, due to the period I lived through, and I was educated and, you know, from a middle class background, I was so conscious of class and the absence of choices for people. So I had to reconsider a lot of that, but also not to read backwards. How did it appear to them at the time? Those who felt, for example, that they were really contributing to the common good, even though we could come at a later stage as a historian and say, look what you did, look what you were responsible for. I started thinking differently about those people, and it wasn't about one particular individual. I think as well in relation to culture, I have come to such an appreciation of how novelists and playwrights can excavate our condition in a way that historians just cannot. And I remember Gary Hines here in Galway describing Tom Murphy, the playwright, and she said the questions that Tom Murphy are asking, or the one question he's really asking is, how did a fucked up person like me come about? And he spent 50 years trying to explain that through his plays. And Enda Walsh now more recently as a younger playwright will be talking about how your environment is churning you. And you're being churned around inside that environment and what it might do to you. I got much more of an appreciation of just how blessed we are with our cultural robustness. And it's very appropriate that I would say this here at an arts festival. But the avalanche that I referred to earlier on, and the difficulty of sifting through it and finding perspective, the more emotional clarity I was able to find through those kind of wordsmiths. And poetry, I use poetry a lot, and not necessarily just the very well-known poets, but also looking at lesser-known poets who might be writing, again, about that emotional hinterland, trying to make sense of it. Diarmaid and Gearóid and poets like that who were responding to Letter Frack. But I also got very... I was in Letter Frack in 2009, and I found visiting the graveyard really difficult and emotional. And because of the graves and because of the ages, and because I knew what went on there, we went on holidays to Letter Frack to rent a cottage in 1981. And there was always reference to what had been there, but it was never spoken about. And when it came to looking at the history of Letter Frack, I found a description that a Christian brother, a word that a Christian brother had uttered. And he said to the boys, "You will always be identified by your sheepish look." And it's the most devastating line that I've read in relation to that area. And I thought, there you are. You are being promised a future of degradation and humiliation and shame. And then it was pointed out to me, who did they send to Letterfrack? Which Christian brothers did they send to Letterfrack as opposed to other schools? And it got me thinking again about what went on internally. So there are moments like that that affect you personally, affect the way you write your history. And there's an emotional side to that which I wouldn't see as a problem.
No.
I think it's.
I wouldn't see it as something to be resolved.
No,
it's something to
it's not about having all of the answers.
No.
And it's also about recognizing that we got to a stage in this country as well where so much was coming out that it couldn't be absorbed. You know, I used to be amused when I would hear people 2 days after a 3,000-page report came out saying, this report is a disgrace. And, you know, and some of them may have been a disgrace, you know, but that wasn't a conclusion reached on the back of reading it, you know. So there was an awful lot, there's an awful lot of short-termism. And I mean, you know, people are looking for the executive summaries. They're not necessarily digging down
into the evidence.
Into the evidence.
I'm going to call a halt to it there. Incidentally, the shortest of short personal footnotes to that. I belong to a generation, obviously, or maybe two before you. But when we were boys, we were every year brought out one day in the year to a sports event in the industrial school in Glynn from Limerick. And we were prepared for the trip out, 2 buses, and told essentially how fortunate we were, that these boys were not fortunate. They had erred and so on, but that they were there. But that we were in fact to mix. There was no question of being among ourselves. And the tables were laid out with buns, the buns with the butterfly wings on them, and lashings of cream and tea and so on. And we were instructed, we were to talk to the person sitting next to us and talk to them about what we were doing and what they were doing and so on and so forth, to normalize it and our experience. And the Christian brothers who were there and the Christian brothers who brought us out were intent upon doing some kind, I'm saying some kind of social initiative. Whether it was, you know, to discourage us as to the fate that awaited you if you transgressed, or to effectively normalize the experience. But it was a simple afternoon that remains in my mind from those days in the primary school. And Mara Jarshid ni and you've now and ye a horn ahead. Now, Katrina, could we?
We're out of time
Yes.
now, but I'm going to give you permission to do 10 minutes, unless somebody objects to that from the authorities here. 10 minutes of question, but no more than that.
Yes, we were.
Can we bring up the lights, folks?
Just want to bring up the lights, Gearóid.
We were a little late starting, I suppose, but yes. Now, okay, folks, are there microphones, Katrina?
There's one down here.
Hi there, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. One of the things that we didn't touch on in the talk was the influence of the EU. And I'd just be interested in your views on that, and particularly the maturing, I suppose, of the EU during those years.
It's fascinating to trace the Irish attitudes to Europe through the Eurobarometers. You know, the way they would measure public opinion in the European community. We've always been top of the class. During Brexit, 85% of Irish respondents thought that the EU was a positive force in Irish life. It's way ahead of anything else. And of course, for a lot of us, a lot of it was transactional over the years, you know, in terms of it being sold in a particular way, that this is what you get for EU membership. It became something different in relation to more recent years. But I also think there are problems there because big questions are being asked now about energy and defence and security and migration and climate change. It's going to become more difficult for Ireland. And I suspect, because it happened briefly during this period that I've been covering. You'll remember the Nice and Lisbon referendums being run twice because we got the wrong answer the first time. And there was a degree of hostility entering. You know, the new EU won't see you and won't hear you, you know. So, I mean, that narrative is by no means over, you know. So I think there are an awful lot of things that will continue to impact, but also that we will be reminded that for all our centrality to recent political controversies, most obviously Brexit, that we are still very peripheral in many ways, and I suspect that might even become more pronounced, and that will in turn probably affect people's attitude to the EU. But there's still broadly speaking, a very positive. I compared it to, say, Denmark. You know, they have a very troubled relationship with EU and EU identity, you know. But how deep we have a European identity is another matter altogether.
Good morning. Thank you very much indeed for a really interesting and excellent morning. If I may say that you charged 1995 admission prices rather than 2000, I saw on that. So a really interesting morning. Thank you very much. I'm one of those objectional creatures to both of you whose second favourite subject in secondary school was history, but my mother wanted me to do medicine, so I had to give it up for chemistry on that. But I'm always sort of one of those people who's interested in it. You've mentioned Greece and others. Is there any other country we can look towards who's ahead of us in sort of trying to deal with those issues that you've outlined and who have perhaps charted a way to doing it perhaps better than we have done?
Yeah, I mean, you are drawn towards the Finnish and the Swedish experiences. Again, you have to add all sorts of caveats. You know, Finland do a lot of things very cleverly as well. One of the things I was interested in was the price of creches. You know, and they did a European-wide survey, and you know the average weekly creche price in Belgium and Denmark and Finland and Sweden was about 60 to 70 euro, and it was 186 euro in Ireland per week. Now I know there are differences and all that. That's a huge thing, you know, childcare. And again, going back to this quality of life and how you might measure it, I often find these measurements quite opaque because it's frequently asserted that we have the best quality of life in the world. You know, depending on which survey that you're reading. Whereas when you're looking at how say Finland approaches the idea of living at home, we know now that 68% of our 25 to 29-year-olds are living at home. That's not good for them, and it's not good for whoever else is in the house. The equivalent figure in Finland is 6%. 6% of that age cohort. Now, but that's again because they have put a lot of thought into how you manage the social business of housing and so on. So there are a lot of areas that we could learn. It's tough. I'm sure it's sometimes too simplistic to say, can we take a bit of that and a bit of that? And like, we also have to come to terms with our own unique selves and how these issues and themes have evolved in Irish society for specific Irish reasons. But there's no harm at all to be reminded that it can be managed effectively, and that's true of health and housing.
Our comparative lens, though, there is a difficulty that we've historically had, in the sense that we are slap bang in the middle of the Atlantic highway of monolingual Anglosphere thinking, whether it's in popular culture coming from America or for a long time through sport and leisure coming from the UK and so on. And even more recently, and I'm as much a junkie of this as anybody. We were fascinated by the minutiae of votes in the outer suburbs of Manchester at 4 a.m. As to whether or not the Lib Dems are gone up a 0.5% or down a 0.4%. And there are seismic events happening in Hungary. There are seismic events happening. You mentioned Finland and the rapid rush for NATO membership because of the Russian aggression stuff. We don't do comparative stuff either in the welfare area or indeed in terms of system stuff as a routine coverage in our media. It may be a linguistic thing, but I think it's rather more. We are simply lazy. We are simply lazy in giving ourselves comparative frameworks for viewing.
And we have to watch it in education as well, and it's worth saying this in a university. You know, I was looking at that. Stephen Ball wrote a book called The Education Debate in Britain, and it's, you know, it's about the idea that education is there to service the market and service the economy and the managerialism that comes with it. And obviously, a lot of people working third level have resented various aspects of that. But when I was an undergraduate in UCD, the president of UCD was a philosopher. I mean, can you imagine appointing a president of one of our universities today who was a philosopher? I mean, you'd be laughed at. And there's a message in that, you know. We have an obsession in this country as well with getting into or some have an obsession with getting into the top 100 universities. And I remember...
no, there'd be nothing wrong with having a medic, of course.
Yeah. But I mean, this question, for a country of this size and how realistic that is, and even how desirable it is in terms of what you have to do to reach that measurement and how they are measured at all. And I remember I had to deputise at one stage at a meeting. I never go to these meetings, but I ended up going to a meeting where a vision was being outlined by a technocratic president. And the goal of the presidency was to get Ireland in, or get the university into the top 100 in the world. And I said at the end, well, if you don't achieve that, will you have regarded your term as a failure? Wouldn't answer the question. But then I said, well, what about a university that's a good place to study and a nice place to be and has a strong sense of community? Is that not more important than the league table? And there are models that they were following there, which I'm not going to serve us. So I'm making the point as well. We have to mind that we have, because it's one of our great strengths.
Thank you very much for an excellent talk, and I just wanted to share an observation with you, talking about revelations as you were, and one revelation to me was when you were talking about the context of the peace process and the loss of dependables for a lot of people. And I was just thinking about the German unification, and it was such a loss of dependables for the people in the East, which, as far as I can see, is very much reflected in today's politics and the shift to the right. And that is also something that maybe we should keep in mind and learn from. Thank you.
Yes. And there's a nostalgia that develops as well that can be, hugely unsettling, and
One more intervention, and then all smiles like Browning's Das Duchess, wasn't it? All smiles will stop together. One last intervention. Not while ahead there. Right. There's up at the back, yes.
Chairman, on the subject of Brexit, and in particular as it affected the North, arguably it was a good thing because it shook London and Dublin out of the complacency, whereby the North was solved because at least they weren't killing each other. 3,700 of them were just killing themselves.
No, I think that's a fair point. And one of the things I'm doing next month is go to Belfast. It's 100 years since the Irish Boundary Commission met this year. It met for the first time in 1924 to try and settle the border question. And the border question, as we know, was not settled. And you're absolutely right. I mean, there was a degree of denial and complacency around tying up the parcels. That bit is done now. And of course, they were never done. And it's one of the lessons of that, which we've talked about here before, about that period of the 1920s, is just all of the unfinished, tangled, knotted legacies that we shouldn't deny. And I think, Brexit did certainly propel a lot of them to the forefront again.
We're going to have to leave it there, folks. May I ask you to show your appreciation?
Well done.
Thank you.